Thanks, Gary. Appreciate you helping us out today with leading worship. Grateful for your gifts and you using them in this way. If you're joining us online, we're really glad that you're doing that for our service today. Well, here's one of the realities of life. All of us have some relationships that are tenuous at best, right? Sometimes it's people from our family. Sometimes it's people outside of our family that we have relationships with that are a little bit different. You know, different kind of like Cousin Eddie or Cousin It or maybe someone worse than that. Sometimes it's just that people are, a little odd and they're just a little, it's just a little difficult to interact with them because they're a little odd. Not that odd is the worst thing in the world. It's just, that way. On the other end of the conversation is sometimes it's people who are just, they're toxic. There are things about them, who they are, what they're doing, what they're talking about, what they're saying, that is just downright toxic. Now, let me give you a great tip here. If you're thinking through your family or your friend group and you can't figure out who the odd one is or who the toxic one is, just look in a mirror, right? That'll zero you right in on what that is like. Now, one of the things then that happens is that oftentimes in these relationships, in these cases, we are left wondering, what do we do exactly? I mean, do we just roll with the oddness because, being a little bit odd generally never hurt anybody? But if it's toxic, what do we do? What do we do with that? How do we navigate that? Do we tolerate it and just look the other way and say, oh, that's just how so-and-so is? Or do we try to mitigate the toxicity somehow or another? Or do we just exit the relationship and just get out of it and get away from it and move off? Today, we are going to talk about a topic called radioactive relationships as we wrap up our sermon series titled Soul Detox. So we've been thinking this fall together about this idea, this title that I first heard of from Pastor Craig Groeschel in a book that he wrote by the same name. Just as a reminder for us, detox is a regimen or treatment intended to remove toxins, impurities, or addictive substances from the body. So in this series, we've been thinking together about some of the things that can function as a maelstrom or a whirlpool or a toxic thing for our souls in our lives. And we've been thinking together about how we need to work and have some divine help to detoxify our souls from these things. One of the best things about Craig Groeschel's book is that over and over and over again, it brought me back to the place where, well, even if you're struggling with this, Jesus is involved and is working with you on it to have it become better. One of the other major strategies that we've been talking about is just the idea of how do we avoid these things to begin with. If we can learn what they are, if we can begin to identify them, if we can begin to see them starting to surface in us or around us, maybe we can just turn the rudder and head a different direction and avoid having to deal with it. So we're going to talk about radioactive relationships today. The subtitle of this chapter in Craig's book is Loving Unhealthy People Without Getting Sick. Loving unhealthy people without getting sick. You might know this already, but radioactive stuff is really strange stuff. One of the most challenging things about it is that unlike how it shows up in the movies, it does not generally glow green and sound an alarm to tell you that it's there. Rather, radioactive stuff is one of those things that is virtually invisible. You can only detect it by either seeing the effects of what it's doing or having the right equipment to pick it up. And yet it has the possibility of doing severe harm or even fatal damage to life. Sadly, some relationships fit into that kind of a category. As family, friends, or even on some level as Jesus followers, many of us have the thought and the belief, and I think a correct thought and a correct belief, that we should try to help people who are unhealthy. But the challenge remains then, how do we love and help unhealthy people without becoming sick ourselves in the process of doing it? George Washington is referenced as saying the following: associate with men of good quality if you esteem your own reputation, for it is better to be alone than in bad company. Craig Rochelle writes something a little bit similar to that and a lot more lengthy. In this chapter of the book, he writes these words: the people closest to you will hands down be your greatest spiritual asset or your worst spiritual curse. Those you spend the most time with can propel you closer to God, serving Him faithfully and pleasing Him in all you do. Or toxic tag-alongs, and by the way, that note is actually in the book. A toxic tag-along sounds like some kind of spoiled Girl Scout cookie, which I thought was pretty funny. Anyway, toxic tag-alongs can corrupt your good intentions and rob you of the blessings God wants to pour out on you. After you've swum in their poisonous presence, they leave you sitting in a puddle of sewage, nursing a corroded soul. Now, both of these quotes, in different ways, reflect ideas that surface in the biblical text more times than you can possibly count. They show up all over the Jewish Testament or the Old Testament, particularly in the Psalms and in the Proverbs, where you get these kinds of statements about being very aware of people around you and the influence that they have in your life and what kind of influence they're wielding on you. And the Christian Testament, the New Testament, is just as full of these same kinds of ideas. So don't worry, we're not going to try to look at all of them today. But one of them is summed up well in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 33. And it is this statement: do not be deceived. Bad company corrupts good morals, as it's translated in the New English translation. Now, this statement, do not be deceived, do not be fooled, do not be misled, are some of the various ways that this is translated, means in part that it is possible for us to be misled, to be deceived, to be fooled. It is a potential reality for us in our lives. Now, what's really interesting about this statement is that by itself, it's pretty strong and it's pretty straightforward. But it was not ever a by itself statement. Rather, it is in a context where Paul is writing about not being fooled by those who claim there is no resurrection of the dead. I don't know if it ever occurred to you or not, but there are people out there, and there were even people who were within the community of faith who just believed that resurrection wasn't a thing, that it wasn't going to happen to us, that if it did happen to Jesus, it's not something that transpires to everybody else. So realistically, when you live this life, it's just you live it to the end and it's done. The Apostle Paul refutes that teaching very strongly and gives several examples. And you could look at the rest of 1 Corinthians 15 and see what I'm talking about. He sums it all up by saying, don't be fooled into thinking you can subject yourselves to teachers who claim there is no resurrection of the dead without starting to think that way yourself. Hear that. Not just related to the resurrection of the dead, but there's no way that we can consistently subject ourselves to things that are false teachings or to things that the Apostle Paul characterizes as being bad company without that having some effect on us. And the far end of the spectrum on the effect it can have is it can actually move us to the place where we start to believe the kind of stuff that Paul puts in the category as being absolute nonsense. He sums it up this way: bad company, in this context, false teachers corrupt good morals. Now, what we know is that we often live with and operate in a realm that is kind of like a tightrope or a balance beam concerning this category. Have any of you ever attempted a tightrope? Anybody ever tried that? Oh, I see a slack line maybe, similar kind of concept, not quite the same, but similar. What about a balance beam? Anybody ever done a balance beam? Yeah, that's a good way to make a fool out of yourself, is what that is. One of my nieces was in gymnastics for a while, and when she was first learning, she had a balance beam that was just a few inches off the ground, sitting there. And I went over and looked at that thing, and I got on it, and I learned very rapidly, I don't have very good balance. What I know now as I get older is it's worse. The other night, Nettie and I were sitting on the couch next to each other, and I went to get up, and all of a sudden I realized it wasn't working, and I was starting to lose my balance, and the only thing I could think was, don't hit her in the nose with your elbow as you go back down on the couch, right? And the balance is a tricky thing. Well, balance in life and balance in relationships is also this very tricky thing. And we live in an environment where we are always surrounded by some mixture of people who are really healthy and really good for us, and people who are not all that healthy and who are not all that good for us. Often the very crux of the issue with loving toxic people is simply that balance of how do I love them and not have their stuff corrupt me to where I become something that I don't like in them, that I become something that I don't want to rub off on me. Now, I would suggest that one of the greatest challenges with this is that often it's really hard to see the toxic effect or the negative effect that someone is having on us. Like, it's really easy to look over and say, oh, man, that person's toxic, right? But when they're in our close circle, it's a lot harder to be able to look in the mirror and recognize when it's starting to rub off on us. People, relationships, and especially conversations often tend to work toward the lowest common denominator. When you begin to talk about the way and the direction that certain conversations can and often do go, you can very easily find yourself in a place where it's like a race to the bottom of the barrel. And there's not anything good at the bottom of the barrel, right? It's a race toward things that are toxic and dangerous and destructive. Paul wrote about this very specifically to his young protege Timothy about this kind of thing. 2 Timothy chapter 2 verses 16 and 17, Paul gives Timothy this advice: avoid worthless, foolish talk that only leads to more godless behavior. This kind of talk spreads like gangrene, or the NLT says cancer. Now it's really interesting that in 2 Timothy chapter 1, part of it, and a lot of chapter 2 before this, Paul is writing this letter to his young protege in the faith, Timothy, encouraging him to be a good soldier or a good worker for God who is approved by God, right? To do that Christian living in a way that causes God to look upon it and react toward it with approval. And then Paul pauses to write about a few things that could get in the way of that. That could get in the way of being a good soldier for Christ as an illustrative thing, or to be a good worker for Christ in an illustrative sort of way. And what Paul describes here are relationships that revolve around worthless or worse, foolish talk. Now, you almost immediately probably thought of somebody in your mind that when you're around them, you know where the conversation is going to go. That it's going to head somewhere south, and it's going to head there really, really fast. And they may be yelling or they may be laughing, but you are going to be in an environment where you can just get sucked right in to whatever it is that's going on. Paul specifically here says that it's possible for Timothy, and by extension, that means it's possible for those of us who are Jesus followers to find ourselves influenced in such a way that results in us participating in things that we never meant to get involved in the first place. Conversations that ultimately lead toward worthless and foolish things, foolish conversations that don't just stop there, but according to Paul, lead toward more godless kinds of behavior. Pastor and author Adrian Rogers once said, "Sin will take you farther than you want to go, keep you longer than you want to stay, and cost you more than you want to pay." It seems to be that this sort of idea related to toxic relationships is what Paul has in mind here. To be very careful because it can lead you somewhere relationally, conversationally, lifestyle-wise that you really never intended to go. And interestingly enough, Paul describes it as functioning like gangrene or cancer. They say that an overwhelming portion of all the soldiers who were injured during the U.S. Civil War that had limbs amputated had to have them amputated not because of the wound itself, but because it got infected with gangrene, and if they didn't cut the limb off, the person would soon thereafter die because of how rapidly gangrene can spread throughout the body. Sadly, we all know that cancer can operate in exactly the same way. That it doesn't always play fair, and it doesn't always play nice, and it doesn't always stay in one spot where you can just go get that spot out. But very often it begins to move around and affect and infect other parts of the body, and left alone, it will eventually eat up and consume everything that is there. Paul talks about this kind of a relationship and this kind of conversation as it being like that. That once it starts spreading, it's very difficult to stop. So, if you're tempted to think that, it's just conversation, it's just somebody shooting off their mouth, I can tune that out, it won't affect me. I want you to think about the impact of a particular story that occurs in the life of Jesus. There's an occasion where Jesus is teaching his closest disciples, meaning the 12, not all of everybody else who might be following him. And what he's teaching them and talking to them about is what is really going to happen to him in the not too distant future. He tells them that on purpose he is going to Jerusalem, which they all knew at the point that he's telling them this, that Jerusalem was a dangerous place for Jesus to be and for them to be as his followers. He says that he'll deliberately go there because it's necessary. And he does it even though going there would mean that he's going to suffer terrible things and eventually be killed. And he's talking very plainly and very straightforward with his followers about this. And then the following conversation unfolds with Peter, who is among the three closest to Jesus. And here's how the text reads in Matthew 16. But Peter took him aside and began to reprimand him for saying such things. Excuse me? Can you imagine being brave enough to reprimand Jesus? Can you imagine refusing to believe what Jesus says will happen? Can you imagine what follows? Peter says to him, "Heaven forbid, Lord, this will never happen to you." Like not in a questioning sort of way, but in a statement sort of way. And in verse 23, Jesus turns to Peter and says to Peter, one of his closest followers, the inner three of the closest circle to Jesus, Jesus says these words, "Get away from me, Satan. You're a dangerous trap to me. You are seeing things merely from a human point of view and not from God." Imagine that if you're foolish enough to reprimand Jesus, and you're foolish enough to refuse to believe what he said, that you would be in a scenario where Jesus would respond how he does. Notice how Jesus characterizes what Peter says to him. Jesus, this is the Son of God in human form, saying to Peter that this line of thinking is a dangerous trap for him. You ever stop to think that there were things that happened to Jesus while he was here as a human being that could rub off on him in ways that could be a dangerous trap for him. He equates it to being like the temptation that Satan brings. Now, Jesus would probably know more about that than anybody else, right? Because we know that very early in his ministry, when he began to publicly acknowledge who he was and began to minister to people out of who he was, that the Spirit took him away in the wilderness, and he was there for a long period of time without food or water, and then Satan comes, allowed by the hand of God deliberately to tempt him, right? And it's this giant collision of the two sides of things, God's side and Satan's side, and Jesus answers and refutes Satan at each point. But it is called the temptation of Jesus because what Satan offered had the potential to be temptations that Jesus might actually move toward. So in this instance, in response to Peter, he says, you're functioning in my life right now exactly like Satan has functioned in my life. Why would this thing be a dangerous trap for Jesus? Well, in context, it would be a dangerous trap for Jesus because in part, it would be a lot nicer to go about things in the way Peter describes than to go about things in the way Jesus knows they're supposed to happen. Right? What Peter says would be nicer and easier and less painful. Right? And Jesus says, can't be that way. Cannot function in that way. And so simply put, Jesus recognizes when even one of his closest followers is doing something that is relationally toxic to him. Now, he also responds accordingly. Here's your second tip of the day. I would not suggest that you go tell people you struggle with to get away from you because they're Satan. Especially not if it's in your family. I would strongly urge you not to do that. However, sometimes we need to recognize when people and their ideas are working like this in our lives. Where who they are and what they're doing and what they're saying and what they're encouraging us toward and what they're drawing us toward would take us somewhere that we do not actually want to do. So, what are we to do when we realize or we recognize that someone we dearly love is really toxic for us? What do we do with that? Well, distilling a few things from the text that we've looked at today and from Craig Rochelle's writings and from other places in the Scriptures that we didn't talk about specifically today, let me recommend three things that I believe will help. One of them is to have good boundaries. Having boundaries is okay. Having places beyond which someone is not allowed to go in your life is okay. Recognizing for us, even as followers of Jesus, that it's okay and important to draw some healthy lines, even in regard to relationships with those that we love. In the text that we looked at today, Paul encourages it, and Jesus modeled it all over his ministry. Think about this. Jesus loved everyone equal, but he did not treat everyone equally in this regard. Meaning, could they cross all the boundaries or not? Think about it this way. Jesus chose 12 people, not 12,000 people, to be in the group that he was going to work the most closely with. And while there's no doubt that he loved everyone in the whole world, he didn't choose everyone in the whole world to be in his inner circle. Matter of fact, we know that out of the 12, there were 3, Peter, James, and John. Yeah, the same Peter that reprimanded Jesus, were in an inner circle that had access to and opportunities with Jesus that was even more than the rest of the 12. And he was very discerning about what they were saying and what they were doing and how he was interacting with them. Let me tell you this, and you may know this, but you may not, or maybe you know it and you need to hear it. But despite popular opinion, it is okay to tell people that you love them, but you're not going to do what they're doing. You're not going to say what they're saying. You're not going to be like they are being. It is okay to tell them that you love them, but you're not going into those spaces. Second, take strong measures to protect your own faith and your own health. Remember the subtitle, Loving Toxic or Unhealthy People Without Becoming Unhealthy or Toxic Ourselves. Sometimes you have to limit the access that people have to you if they're in that box of being toxic. And sometimes you've got to make choices to limit your interactions with those that you know can easily influence you in or me in bad ways. We can do things like refusing to participate in conversations that are headed to the bottom of the barrel from the very beginning. We can refuse to participate in activities that are leading us toward things that are more compromising in nature. It's okay to tell people that you aren't participating and why you're not participating, and respectfully ask them, don't take me in that direction. It's okay to have relationships where you are taking strong measures to protect your own faith and health. Please remember that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself and or for someone else is to refuse to go along with their bad and toxic stuff. And the last one is harder, but is true. Cut ties only as a last resort. You know, you hear a lot of people today bemoaning the fact that we live in a throwaway society. Right, stuff isn't built to last anymore. They make all this stuff that it's designed to use it once and throw it in the trash. And there's some truth to that, right? You don't have to look very hard to see that. Sadly, we also tend to live in a throwaway society with relationships, where it's way too easy to exit. It's way too easy to cut off. It's way too easy to decide, I'm not having anything to do with that person anymore. Hear me clearly. I'm not saying there's never a time when that doesn't have to happen. But I am saying that our society tends to go to that as like a first or a second resort, and not as a 70 times 7 resort as it relates to Jesus' teaching about forgiveness. There may be times when, in order to stay healthy ourselves, we have to cut ties with someone. There may be times where, in order to stay true to our faith, we need to cut ties with someone. However, I want to suggest to you that this should very strongly be the exception to the rule. If there's no way to continue a relationship without it being toxic to your life or your faith, or if all of your sincere efforts to have good boundaries and to take strong measures to protect your own health don't work and they're consistently bypassed, then maybe as a last resort, and even then only in a loving, Christ-honoring sort of way, cut ties. And listen, hear me clearly. I'm not giving you permission to walk out of a relationship. I'm not giving you permission to throw your aggravating kids out on the street. I'm not giving you permission to refuse to take care of some difficult family member. I'm just saying that there are times when you arrive at a place where it's the only thing that you can realistically do that's good for you, and you pray and beg God that something about doing so will also be good for them. If we don't know exactly how to do this, which, by the way, I would say it's not an exact science, and it's really hard to know when and where and in what relationships we make these drastic decisions. I want to suggest to you that Jesus is the perfect example for how to navigate this. And if you read the story about his life, you see him navigating this territory all the time. You see him navigating it with people that loved him. You see him navigating it with his closest followers. You see him navigating with people who are kind of interested in him but are not sure where they're at about it. And you see him navigate it even with people who hate his guts and are out to kill him from the very get-go. You can look into the life of Jesus, and with some time and patience and reading and observation, you begin to get a good baseline on how did Jesus navigate this kind of territory in his own life. Among the things that we need to detox our souls from as followers of Jesus are radioactive relationships. And we need to follow the guidance of being careful to love unhealthy people without getting sick ourselves. Join me in a prayer. Lord, this might be one of those categories of this series that is the most difficult to identify and the most difficult to navigate in good and productive and in healthy ways. We feel the tension of the call of Jesus that no one is unredeemable, and that we're to love people like Jesus loved them. And we feel that tension on the one hand with friends and family members and even just those in our society. And on the other hand, we feel the tension of not always knowing when someone's toxicity is rubbing off on us or when it's taking us somewhere we don't really intend to go. And so, Lord, I'm going to ask for myself today, and maybe my friends here today would also ask this, that you would give wisdom as to what relationships in our lives are truly toxic versus just being a little bothersome. And would you give us wisdom to know what steps to take to navigate it well in a way that honors you and in a way that honors our faith, in a way that honors our own health, and in a way that even loves them. Lord, may you give us the ability to do this in a way that looks really different than what our culture and what our society around us tells us to do with it. May we not pull out of toxic relationships too soon, but may we also not be people who are guilty of letting them drive us away from you. So, Lord, we ask again for your help to remove radioactive relationships from our lives. We believe that you have the guidance and the ability to direct us toward it if we open ourselves toward you, that you want us to be able to navigate this well. And so we ask for your help in doing it. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.